The last time I discussed slavery on this channel, the video was titled The Stupidest Argument About Slavery. And as much as I hate to admit it, I was wrong. Because wow, are there worse arguments out there. Now, the majority of your comments were great, they were kind, they were courteous, and some brought up some really insightful points that I hadn't considered before. But I was deceived, for there are always the negative comments. Deep in neo-Confederate ideology, in the fires of culture war nonsense, the trolls and contrarians rehashed long debunked arguments, and into these arguments they poured their cruelty, their ignorance, and, at least it kind of feels like it sometimes, their will to dominate people with more melanin than they have. But there were some who resisted. A last alliance of Brandon F. and his Patreon supporters marched against the negative comments, and on the very slopes of, YouTube videos, they fought for the freedom of, actual flipping thought to be put into arguments. Look, alright, I don't know what inspired, the weird pseudo-Lord of the Rings thing there, but you get the point. There are plenty of bad arguments out there, so I'm going to talk about some of my favorite ones, for lack of a better word, so that you too might better understand how to deconstruct and tear them apart. Let's start with one that I know we have all heard. Well, sure, slavery was bad, but do you know who were the ones to sell the slaves to start with? This one is just swell, because it implies this strange sort of black and white morality, pun not intended, although definitely appropriate, to the question of slavery. It also implies that these races, quote-unquote, were acting as single unitary blocks, another common theme in these arguments, as we'll see later on, or at the very least, it implies that people are arguing such things. Now, the state of history education, regardless of where you are, who you are, and when you are, it's probably pretty horrible, I know. And I'm sure that, there are a lot of people out there who really do think that the slaves were all just taken from African nations or tribes that were conquered by European powers in a very clear-cut case of perpetrator and victim. The whites are the baddies, the blacks are the goodies, and nothing beyond that. I'm sure that there are people out there who believe that sort of narrative, and they would be wrong. This is what makes historical education, and I dare say videos like this, so important. To help combat those flawed perceptions of the past, which influence how people perceive the world today. Who sold the slaves? Well, for the most part, it was other Africans. And unlike the stereotypes a lot of people have, it wasn't just a case of individual tribes kidnapping people and bringing them down to the coastline. There were entire empires with sophisticated economic and political structures that would wage war on a large scale with the intention of enslaving entire peoples and selling them off to all sorts of different markets, of which the Atlantic slave trade was one of them. Places like the Bamana Empire, the Bornu Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate would generate massive revenues by which they could continue to then wage war from this slave trade. Africa was hardly a peaceful land where innocent natives were taken off the streets by evil Europeans. Indeed, even after the West largely abolished the slave trade, and well into the 19th, even 20th centuries, many parts of Africa had a strong and, most importantly, formally organized slave trade. There were even multiple occasions in which, indeed, European imperialist powers would force the lands they conquered to ban slavery, be it through legal, economic, or outright military means. But here's the thing. When you combat that form, one form of ignorance, with the purpose of promoting a different kind of ignorance, you're ultimately not proving anything. You're not winning anything. To attempt to use this genuine and indeed very important historical information as a strange sort of counterattack to a video where I'm describing why an anti-abolitionist argument is a bad one, it just doesn't make any sense, because nothing of what I just said about the African slave trade justifies in any capacity the institution of slavery anywhere. Not in the American South, not in Latin America, not in Europe, not in the Middle East or Africa, anywhere. American slavery isn't suddenly justified or made any objectively better because Africans were also involved in the process. Just because a different entity was doing the selling doesn't mean that the buying is suddenly less of a sin. If anything, engaging with the market just drives the demand for more slaves and ends up making the problem that much worse. You can't have one without the other. At that point, if you really want to get into the, into the chicken or the egg weeds, it's really just a matter of discussing which side was marginally worse. It isn't just a form of whataboutism. It's actually worse than that, because the actual action that's being discussed, it's the same action. It's like one killer trying to whatabout another by saying, well, sure, we both killed people, but you did it first. Did you know that the slaves were actually sold by other Africans? Like, okay, do you expect me to say that, oh, well, no, only white people can be evil, so that must not be true. It must have been only the whites doing the slave, and the blacks were all victims. Like, what utter nonsense. And do you know what's the worst thing about it all? It's that when people use real, actual information like that, but then they twist it for their nefarious purposes, well then suddenly it makes it that much more difficult to discuss that information, even though it's important, without sounding like a jerk. If you listen to just one little snippet of this video, if you were to isolate my audio and put that out as its own thing, you know what, there's probably going to be a lot of people out there who think that I'm somehow trying to justify slavery by making the very argument that I'm pointing out is so ridiculous. But unfortunately, when there are people out there like that, it makes it very difficult to actually have an honest discussion. And that's why these sorts of misconceptions and poorly argued arguments, by the poor logic, just why it's so damaging to just historical knowledge as a whole. Oh, and if you think that argument is silly, well, the next one may even be worse, because depending on how dishonest and manipulative you want to get with it, the argument could be used to justify pretty much anything that you can imagine, from slavery to genocide to not returning the carts at the grocery store. I'll let you determine which of those is the worst of the three. Can you imagine it? People being disingenuous to justify bad things on the internet? It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, my friends, it is true. It happens, and it's what makes this video's sponsor so important. Ground News is a great way to better understand the news that you're consuming. They don't so much report on the news itself, they report on the people who are reporting the news. For every headline, they collect together the different articles and sources that are reporting on it, and they show you just how much they differ so that you can better understand the bias which is inherently behind them. For example, a few weeks ago, King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands made a pretty big statement about his country's role in the slave trade, and regardless of what you believe about the subject, I think we can all agree that it's pretty complicated. Well, rather than just looking to a single report, let's look at Ground News, where we can see that of the nearly 200 different sources that are all talking about this same issue, the attention is overall pretty even, but leaning a tad to the political left. Then scrolling down, you can read all of these different headlines to see the varying language which different sources use to describe ultimately the same issue, and the subtle differences in that language which could then lead to dramatically different interpretations. From there, you can easily click on the headlines to read those full articles. And you can go deeper, too, checking in on the ownership of those organizations. Are they all owned by the same mega conglomerate, or are they independent? They even have a factuality measurement based on just how factual the different sources generally are in their reporting. And on that, it's important to note as well that Ground News is pretty transparent as well. If you go to their About section, you'll find full guides on all their different rating systems and how they're applied. I also love how the website simultaneously allows you to customize your home page with the subjects that you're interested in, while also avoiding slipping into those echo chambers, because it's usually really easy to do so. Not only because it's showing you all the different sources within any given category you choose, but also through the My News Bias tab, where you'll get a full assessment on all the different stories that you've read to help you better understand your own approach when it comes to the news. It helps you to round out your worldview and to make better, more informed decisions about how you interact with this information, and of course about these important global issues on the whole. I think it's a really interesting service, so if you'd like to learn more about it, you can visit the link in the description to try it out, and you can even get up to 30% off their unlimited access plans when you sign up before August 5th. Thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to those awful, terrible arguments. Well, sure, slavery is bad, but it's been a part of the human experience for thousands of years. Once again, when you're met with this kind of thing in real life, it can be difficult to formulate a response to it. Not because the argument is just that good, but because it's just that bad. Because the natural response to it would probably be something along the lines of, okay. It almost feels like a straw man, except for when you actually witness it. But just because something was done by others at one time doesn't somehow change its moral impact at another time. This argument follows a line of thinking that we cannot judge the past, and again, that entire peoples and cultures operate as singular blocks to which we might ascribe complicated philosophical ideals and actions, which is obviously not the case. Sure, it says, we understand slavery to be evil now, but the past, it was a different time. People didn't think that way in the 18th or 19th centuries. It just wasn't how the world worked. It's also a little bit of implication that people back then were just stupid, which is utterly ridiculous, of course. And now, sure, if we're talking about, like, the Bronze Age, ancient Assyria or something, well then, yes, I agree that applying these modern issues of morality with a very broad brush, as to say, oh, well, the Assyrians were evil, but this other power they were fighting weren't evil, that would be ridiculous, because their world was almost entirely alien from our own. Now, I believe that moral discussions and judgments in these sorts of areas, they are possible, but only when you have a very deep understanding of that world, and with these discussions taking place in very narrow and focused areas. As someone pointed out to me, the actual conception in these environments of slavery for a conquered foe may have actually been a mercy, and in that way, the power that's doing the slaving might be the good guys when compared with the guys who aren't, because the alternative would just be that everyone you conquer needs to be killed, because then the attacker could expect to deal with an uprising and even more like civil war stuff down the road. It'd lead to more suffering and violence, blah, 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 blah. You can have these conversations. This could be an entire book. As much as my philosophy major brain wants to keep on going with it, we're supposed to be talking about the early modern world here. My point is, you can make judgments and such, but it's very, very difficult, and you have to really treat it on an individual basis, especially when you go back that far. But for our purposes here, for the purposes of at least the 18th century onwards, although really for any time period, no cultural group is ever a monolith. And whenever you're having these sorts of moral discussions, that is a very important thing to keep in mind. If anything, the Enlightenment ensured that a greater degree of variance in moral thought and debate was around than ever before. And there was no singular moment in human history when some external force suddenly gifted unto humanity this radical idea that slavery was wrong. It was, as with all cultural shifts, for better or worse, a slow and steady process of particular thoughts and ideas spreading throughout a population. There were gradients to these thoughts as well, just as there are today. On one side, you had then radical abolitionists calling for the complete abolishment of the trade and for former slaves to be made equal citizens. Then, of course, you had those who wanted them to be freed, but then maybe deported. Or for the abolishment of slavery to be a slower process of phasing people out of bondage. Some people will be liberated now, some people will be later on. Perhaps the children of slaves will be freed, but the actual slaves themselves will stay that way. All sorts of different ideas on what to do about this institution. Then, of course, there were variants on the side of preserving slavery as well, along with numerous different kinds of justifications for that preservation, from religious to economic ones, and everything in between. And again, as an American, I'm going to focus on the American experience here, and certainly on the experience which most of my viewers are familiar with. By the time of the American Civil War, it is beyond ridiculous to claim that, oh, it was just the times. Because by the 1860s, not only had the majority of the Western world banned slavery, but even within the United States itself, a slaving power, there was obviously a large, a popular abolitionist movement. Slavery was not an accepted part of the times. It was understood by a great many people to be something deeply immoral, and if nothing else, it was a matter of very wide debate, with many different ideas all floating around. The only way to still claim this strange idea that morality is determined by the status quo would either be to reduce the geographical area by which we draw these moral boundaries, aka, oh, well, maybe not in the nation on the whole, but it was what was accepted in the South, so we can't blame people in the South for doing so, or we have to somehow suppose that these Southerners were in a complete informational vacuum. Now, the latter there is obviously ridiculous, and the former, well, that might be used to justify quite literally anything. When you can draw these precise borders however you like based on purely arbitrary designations, to say nothing, of course, of how even in the South there were abolitionists, it would be like trying to gerrymander morality. It just doesn't work. Well, sure, the majority of the civilized world knew that slavery was evil, but it's just how things were done in this particular part of this one particular country, so we can't question it. That would be sort of like a moral imperialism, dictating our morality onto others in a different context. Well, you might just as well say, well, sure, the majority of the neighborhood knows that, kidnapping people and locking them in the basement is evil, but in that one creepy house down at the end of the block, well, that's just how things are done. We can't possibly impose. That would be wrong. The argument just collapses when you can change the boundaries however you like to make certain elements look better than they ought, to basically change the conditions until you're finally correct. Although even then, I believe that we could very easily argue that it doesn't matter if everyone agrees on something, it doesn't make it right. Now, if there wasn't any sort of precedent for abolition, well, then that might change things in a pretty big way. If a society was built around slavery for the better part of its entire history, and then suddenly people started talking about just completely dismantling it, well, even if it seems like it's going to be the right thing to do, it's pretty scary. I mean, who knows what the results are going to be? It could be even worse. It could lead to even more suffering, to more death than the alternative. And unless your name is Immanuel Kant and you're a very silly man indeed, I think most of us would agree that that in turn would actually be even more immoral than the previous situation. I mean, there could be violent rebellions, there could be race wars in the streets, there could be economic devastation, and an outright collapse of the society which let itself off a cliff, blinded by its own good intentions. Absolutely, that is a major, even a very valid concern, and I think that it's the best way to look at certain pro-slavery individuals with a more balanced perspective and could help us to understand why they believed what they did without just blindly condemning them as, oh, they're just evil, that's why. That's a disservice to history. However, always a however, we must also understand that in certain environments like the antebellum South, this wasn't the case. especially by the mid-Victorian era, not only had slavery been outlawed in many different societies, it had been done by different means. There were violent uprisings in places like Haiti. There were programs of steady emancipation which respected the so-called property rights of owners, like in Britain. There were cases of immediate and absolute emancipation. There were even cases of slavery being reintroduced after being gotten rid of. These changes were made in poor societies, wealthy societies, colonial empires. By the time that Jeff Davis took over, there were tons of amazing case studies, good ones and bad ones, in how a nation might go about at least beginning the process, looking into it, examining the process of abolishing slavery effectively, if, that is, the society so chose. So this whole, oh, well, slavery's been a thing for thousands of years, it isn't just irrelevant to the discussion of the institution. It is a matter of increasing damnation as more time goes by, in that there were increasingly good arguments and indeed real-life examples in how and why it should have been gotten rid of. If the idea of keeping slavery was a deeply immoral one, even in 1833 by that point, well then how much worse was it 3 decades later? And yet worse, indeed, in other societies, like in that of Brazil, or indeed in certain African states that were in communication with the West, had no excuse for not figuring it out, places like Zanzibar, perhaps. Oh, and speaking of time, that reminds me of another terrible thing that people like to bring up whenever I mention I'm going to make a video or two about slavery. Well, are you going to talk about slavery nowadays, too? What? No. For the same reason that I'm not going to talk about the wars in Ukraine, Yemen, or the Sudan when I discuss early modern warfare. Or why I wouldn't mention Mexican drug cartels in a video about the Opium Wars. I mean, yeah, sure, these are all really interesting, really important topics, and I definitely have an awful lot to say about it all. I'm an opinionated kind of guy. But they're a little outside of the scope of the topics, aren't they? Modern slavery, as horrible and worthy of attention as it is, isn't particularly relevant to my discussion of the various moral arguments surrounding the legal state of chattel slavery in specific historic environments. Or at the very least, while there are obvious connections to be had, the particular approach that I was taking to discuss the topics, well, there wouldn't be an obvious connection there. So to somehow try and arbitrarily, tie it all in, it would just feel out of place. And I think that, honestly, we can all agree that shoehorning in modern-day political messaging where it doesn't necessarily belong, it gets pretty silly and certainly very tired at times. And of course, if someone's trying to redirect the attention to somehow make their chosen historical agents come across any better, a sort of, oh, well, we're no better than they are, so can we really judge? Well, then once again, the only real reply would be, yeah, we can. That just because a bad thing still exists, albeit in a dramatically different format, doesn't change the moral situation previously. If anything, it just goes to further demonstrate the importance of historical education in learning about these issues so that we can better understand the nuances of such immoralities, both in the past and today. Now that word there, nuance. It's a difficult thing for any of us to truly grasp, because none of us are without our own biases, and yet it's so incredibly important. Especially so for another argument which I would love to discuss, which isn't so much about slavery as it is about the slavers. These are, I believe, different conversations, and significantly so, and yet unfortunately, they're very often conflated together. This one in particular that I'm thinking of, I like to call it the Thomas Jefferson argument, and unlike the other arguments that I've discussed in this video, it's not really a stupid argument. It's actually really quite interesting and very deep in its own way. I think that there's a lot of merit to many of the ideas contained within the argument, even if the core concept itself is still something that I disagree with, and unfortunately, if the argument is often used by disingenuous individuals for purposes outside of the argument's core meaning. Okay, so I know that is incredibly vague, and I apologize for that, but it's a complicated discussion, and it's the sort of thing that I believe needs a lot of disclaimers. Not that people won't, of course, decide to misquote me on it anyways, but hey, maybe the video's sponsor could help with that kind of trouble, eh? But in any case, that argument, the Thomas Jefferson argument, and founding fathers, and oh, they were slaveholders, all that fun stuff we can get into. Well, functionally speaking, it's very different from the rest of this video, and so I'd like to cover it in a future piece of content. It'll certainly be a more difficult conversation than the ones that we've had in these last two videos, and so maybe a little bit more time will be required for it. In the meanwhile, though, I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and have maybe learned a few little rhetorical twists that you might use should you ever encounter these sorts of insidious little misconceptions, which are ultimately used to justify some pretty horrible stuff. Not just about slavery, really, but all sorts of different controversial events in history. It reminds me that I'd probably do well to talk more about some of the, you might say, less positive elements of British imperialism, because I think that a lot of people assume an awful lot of things about my opinions on all that. In any case, though, until we come to those times, thank you for watching, and a most special thanks to the Native Oaks supporters on Patreon, those brave soldiers of our cause for historical education, without whom I would not be able to do what I do. Your generosity is, as ever, very much appreciated. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am, and I shall remain, your most humble and obedient of servants.